Carlton. He did his PhD at the University of Colorado. He is the host of the Great Plains podcast. He is a host on a Life in Ruins podcast. He was on the Cite Bites podcast. He does a lot of podcasting stuff. He also has this great book that came out just this spring that he was an editor on, Indigenizing Archaeology, Putting Theory into Practice. He's now an assistant professor of anthropology and an assistant curator of archaeology at the University of Kansas. And his research utilizes Pawnee and Arikara oral traditions regarding population movement and social change as foundational evidence for interpreting the archaeological record. Several of the sites he's worked on I've visited, and I'm excited to hear about him talk about this more. I've heard him talk a little bit about it before. He's published in a lot of stuff, and he's very active in archaeology. And if he's willing to, I would love it if he'd say a little bit about how he got into archaeology and why he's doing what he's doing before he gets into his talk. But otherwise, I am happy to pass it over to Carlton.
Thank you so much, Chris, and the Archaeological Society for inviting me back. I gave you a presentation a couple of years ago, I think in the midst of COVID while I was finishing my PhD. I really enjoyed the invite then, and I really appreciate being allowed to come back. Absolutely, yeah. So the name of my talk today, everybody, is Cultivating Identity, the Ethnogenesis of the Pawnee People. And Chris, I'm more than happy to talk about how I got into the field or why I got into the field of archaeology. Part of that is I've always had a deep interest in history. It was always the subject I excelled most at in public school. But a large portion of why I got into the field is when my father was the superintendent of the Wind River Indian Reservation and then the Crow Indian Reservation in Wyoming and then Montana. I got to spend a lot of time around tribal historic preservation officers and cultural staff, as well as my family, both my father, my uncles, my aunts, my brothers and sisters. I come from a relatively traditional family that's very connected to their communities. And I was just kind of captivated by archaeology in undergraduate. Took an anthropology class and on Native American archaeology, and just fell in love. And I saw how my identity, my culture, and my passion for history can weave together in a career in archaeology and apply all those things. And that's started the seeds of how I became a professional archaeologist, I suppose. Any other information or questions regarding that? So yeah, we'll just go ahead and dive right into talk. So real quick, Chris, you did a great job introducing me. So this is who I am. Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover. My email for anyone that wants to contact me after the talk. Regarding the talk or any other opportunities or just a chat, my email's there, and Chris has it, and please share it out. So I am the curator of archaeology for the Biodiversity Institute and Natural History Museum here at the University of Kansas, as well as an assistant professor of anthropology in the anthropology department at the University of Kansas. So I have one of those fun 50-50 positions that have quickly become two full-time jobs in their own right. And I'm also an affiliate faculty in both the Museum Studies program and the Indigenous Studies program. Primarily my area of focus is in Great Plains Archaeology. And rather than having my specific archaeological focus be on pottery, beyond projectile points, I've really dived into radiocarbon chronologies or Bayesian statistics to construct radiocarbon chronologies. So I'm really interested in time and space and transitions of changes in culture and movement of people. And then, of course, Indigenous archaeology is really the focus and theoretical framework and methodology in which I apply myself within the field. And tangentially, I'm in the sphere of looking at the dispersal of European horses within the Americas. And so to begin, this presentation today is based off of my dissertation research. So this is actually the first time I've presented my dissertation outside of my defense, primarily because I was a part of this amazing study on the dispersal of horses into the Great Plains and Northern Rockies. And since this publication came out in the spring of 2023, this is mostly what people have asked me to talk on. So I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to actually speak to archaeologists about the research that I'm most involved in and most passionate about. Not that horses aren't cool. It's not what I do. So this is the first time presented on this. So I would really love people's feedback on how this presentation went, so I can refine it for future talks. So to begin, outline, we're going to go over my personal background with the archaeology, some content background to set the stage, some research questions for us to think about as we move forward in this presentation, Northern Caddoan oral traditions, late Holocene archaeology, Bayesian modeling, and some results and future thoughts. I know it's a lot. We're going to get through it. Just let's start it. So, real quick, I'm an Indigenous anthropologist. What does that mean? On one hand, I'm using Indigenous knowledge, so oral traditions, background, and cultural perspectives of the world. And on the other hand, I have archaeological and museum sciences. And what I see myself as doing is being this bridge between these two topics, which within the field of North American archaeology have traditionally been very separate. And so I weave both of these together and I connect them to bring together these different forms of what we thought as different forms of knowledge keeping or perspectives on the world are really one and the same when applied equally and equitably. So personal background, what drives my scholarship? One, I'm keenly fascinated in Indigenous history beyond the European written record, right? Growing up, learning about the Pawnee Nation, I'm a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, formerly of Kansas and Nebraska, that everything I can learn about my people and my culture came from books and from a European perspective and from European accounts. And defragmenting the archaeological record, the divisions that and taxonomy and cultural units that archaeologists have created in order to understand the past are incredibly useful. But looking just beyond these concepts that we use to divide the archaeological record and really look at it as a holistic history in which we can provide to Indigenous nations. And that's where that whole, weaving together, bridging these Indigenous ontologies with archaeological science come into play. So, and as I said, a lot of this framework and what drives me in my research is being a citizen of the Pawnee Nation and being a servant to the people and advocating for our voice within this field. So we're going to be looking at a 1,000-year history of the Central Plains here in the United States, really looking at the woodland period, the late woodland period that starts roughly 500 AD to contact and colonial around 1550. The geographic region we're going to be looking at is the Central Plains. This encompasses the states of Nebraska and Kansas, as well as Eastern Wyoming and Colorado. Really, the boundary we're looking at here is the Missouri River to the east and the Rocky Mountain Front Range to the west. And the reason being is this is the homeland of the Pawnee Nation, as well as the homelands of our sister tribes, the Arikara and Wichita, and the Central Plains is right there within, that is the Pawnee Nation homeland. So, you can see how my indigeneity is driving my work and my research. And here I am at the University of Kansas, well within this boundary, so I'm very happy to be here. And the Northern Caddoan language family, I've mentioned this. What this is made up of are three tribes. One, the Pawnee, the Arikara, as well as the Wichita. So we all belong to the same language family, Pawnee and Arikara. These languages are incredibly similar with some different, the Arikara have a consonant we don't have, and they enunciate differently. This is probably due to their habitation on the Missouri River in the colonial period with the Mandan and Hidatsa, which are Siouan speakers. And then there's the Wichita. The South Band Pawnee are really close to them, but we'll get into that in a bit. Historically, what do the Pawnee look like? When we look at from a European perspective, when there's contact between the Pawnee Nation and Euro-Americans, we have four bands. So these are four subgroups of the Pawnee Nation. You have the Skeety, the Kitkahaki, the Pitahawidata, and the Chawi. The latter three, the Kitkahaki, Pitahawidata, and Chawi, these are known as the South Bands. Each one of these South Bands had maybe one or two towns each, whereas the Skeety had upwards of 13 to 17 towns, and they were clan-based. So each clan had its own town, and sometimes a clan had two towns. So the Skeety were much larger. Additionally, the Skeety are different than the South Bands. One, they have, I'm Skeety, I'm Pahukstatu Skeety, Pumpkin Vine Clan Skeety. We have star knowledge, which is very different than the South Bands. We had a star chart, and we also had some religious practices that were different than the surrounding tribes as well as the surrounding Pawnees that were speak to different origins or different ceremonial protocols. Uh, Realistically, when you look at the Pawnee as a whole, they're really two tribes in one. You have the Skeety as a different group from the South Bands. And the culture history and our cultural landscape really ties us to the Central Plains. We have names for all the river systems and geologic features within the Central Plains, but also in the Western periphery where people don't really think of as Pawnee geography or Pawnee landscape. We have Pawnee Buttes, Pikes Peak, and Spanish Peaks. All these are locations within our cultural geography and have significance to our culture or religion that we weren't just bound to the eastern parts of these states along the Missouri River and its tributaries, but went all the way up into the mountains. And here I am again at the University of Kansas. And then, our boundary that speaks to that, right? One is the solid black lines here on this map. These are the 19th century boundaries of the northern Caddoans. Whereas the dotted line represents our territorial boundary of the entire language family in the 16th century. And the archaeology speaks to this. And the reason why this happened is in 1650, with the adoption of European horses, we have the Apaches, Cheyennes, and Lakotas and Kioways moving down the Rocky Mountain Front Range on horseback and inhabiting the Rocky Mountain, not the Rocky Mountain High Plains, the High Plains, the short grass prairie to the west. And so that's why you end up with smaller tribal territories of the Great Plains farmers to the east, because it's the horse nomads in the 17th century as a result of the introduction of European horses that are now situating themselves in the western part of the plains and have adopted full-time nomadism, chasing the bison as a full-time food source. And therefore, and that's where a lot of tension between the tribes comes later, but that's not the purpose of this talk. So my research questions in this dissertation, and really what drives my research in general, I'm really focused on radiocarbon dating, and how archaeologists in the Central Plains and in the Great Plains region as a whole utilize radiocarbon. And so I developed, and then applied a chronometric hygiene protocol for how Great Plains archaeologists should radiocarbon date what kind of samples we use, but also which ones we use in analyses. And then once this chronometric hygiene protocol is applied, how does this change our understanding of the development and periods of maize-based farming and subsequent social transitions? And then lastly, how do the Pawnee and Arikara oral traditions contribute to interpreting the archaeological record under a new Central Plains chronology? Does anything change? Are the oral traditions more supported with a new chronometric hygiene protocol that then produces new and more precise chronologies that we can then base off of transitions in culture? So this is what I'm really looking at, and why I'm so interested in radiocarbon dates, because as archaeologists, if we don't have control of time, we can't say much about behavior and change within the archaeological record. I mean, that's bread and butter number one. If we don't have control of the dates, everything else is moot. So let's talk about oral traditions and relative chronology building. So when you pull together the Pawnee, Arikara, and Wichita oral traditions about migration, how they get to Nebraska and Kansas, you get a really cohesive and clear, at times. Most of the time it's clear and cohesive. There's a couple wonky things in there, which we'll talk about, but there's a really good narrative here. One, they talk about coming from the Southwest in the land of stone houses. We have no idea what this is or when this is. It is this vague origin story about land of the Southwest. Southwest of what? We're not sure. But archaeologically, if we think about stone houses, where do we generally find settlement patterns in which masonry is a part of that through time? And we get to the Southwestern Mesoamerica. together in the past. And it's really difficult to talk about these groups as cohesive units that walk together through time. But all three talk about being from the Southwest and then moving east. And at the point of the cross of the two timbers in Oklahoma, ancestral Arikaras, or an ancestral population of northern Caddoan speakers, splits off from this main group. And they specifically mention traveling north to the upper Republican River. The rest of the group, the ancestral Pawnees and Wichitas, this other larger group, they continue heading east until they hit the Dark River, which is the Mississippi. At this point, the group starts moving north along the Mississippi River, but along the way, as they're moving northward, they haven't hit the Missouri River yet or traveled up to that point. Ancestral Skeeties, they break off from this Caddoan group of Pawnees and Wichitas, and they go to live with their relatives, the ancestral Rickaras and the Republican. When they get there, the ancestral Skeeties, the ancestral Rickara are living together at some point. And then ancestral Rickaras move north. So they start their own, they keep moving north. The rest of the group, the South Band Pawnees and the Wichitas, they hit the Missouri River. They start traveling west. They meet up with the Skeeties in the upper Republican River. The Skeeties move to central Nebraska. The Arikaras move northeast. And this is relatively an area where you find these groups in the 17th century, with Skeetie Pawnees being a central and northern Nebraska group, the Arikaras being along the Missouri River in the Dakotas, and the South Band Pawnees being in southern Kansas, southern Nebraska, and north central Kansas. And then over time, especially during European colonization and westward expansion of Americans, the Arikara continue moving further up the river into North Dakota. At some point, and this is where that divergence or where things aren't cohesive, there's a couple different Wichita oral traditions which could all simultaneously be true. They all acknowledge they split off from the South Band Pawnees in Kansas to move to Oklahoma. Some say they did it right when they got to Kansas. Others say they did it after staying with the Pawnees for a bit. Both can be true, right? Because multiple populations have left at different times. There might not be this cohesive story. And so moving on to this next point about, well, my question is like, when did Pawnees become maize farmers? When did that transition from hunting and gathering begin? Because these migration stories don't necessarily talk about corn. And corn is incredibly important to these societies. So what do Pawnees say and Wichitas and Rickaras say about this adoption of maize-based agriculture, which is such a pivotal part of their identity? And that's where we can look at the archaeological record, right? So in the 6th century CE, we have holistically on the Great Plains hunters and gatherers. But by the 16th century, 1,000 years later, we have maize-based farmers in large towns. They're fortified. We're having thousands of people live in these communities along the Missouri River and its tributaries. When did this transition begin? And so when we look at additional oral traditions about Pawnee history, right, they don't have dates, but they do have a built-in relative chronology where they mention, well, this event happened when we had this, or this story includes corn, so we know it has this time period. You can develop a relative chronology and one that can be built. We see one is corn is always important. Corn is always first in these oral traditions. Then you have earth lodges and towns, followed by horses, followed by the introduction of the Spanish and meeting the Spanish, and then meeting the Lakota, right? So this is, when you look at an oral tradition, you can have an idea of the framework of where it sits in our history based on what it's mentioning. Corn is the oldest. You get corn, you get earth lodges and towns. Once those are established, horses appear. Once you have horses, then we meet the Spanish. And then also, we met the Spanish before we met the Lakotas. But for the purposes of today's talk, this is where we're really focusing in on corn and earth lodges and towns, the introduction of maize-based agriculture, and settled permanent communities. And then so narrowing down this focus on oral traditions and like looking, okay, who says what about corn? From a Pawnee perspective, we have two interesting divisions. One, the Skeetie band of Pawnees, they always taught, like, corn always comes from Nebraska. They were given corn while living in Nebraska. The South Band Pawnees, on the other hand, talk about having it with them, and planting along the Missouri River as they move towards Kansas and Nebraska. Those are two different stories, right? Those are two different people talking about something different. With Skeeties, they were there first in Nebraska, then they had corn. South Bands brought corn with them along the way. So, looking to the archaeological record, looking at taxonomic units. What does the archaeology say, right? So when we look at hunters and gatherers, we have the late woodland period. Moving to the first people experimenting with agriculture or horticulturalists, we have the Central Plains tradition, Central Plains Oneota, and Great Oasis. We have another group or another taxa. It's called the Pomona variant. We're not sure where it lies within these. It's really this archaeologically speaking, this blend of they're still doing hunting and gathering stuff. They're dabbling in corn, but they're a mix of both. And not much is known about the Pomona variant. No one's researched it. And then we have our full-blown agriculturalists. These are what we call the initial coalescent variant, the extended coalescent variant, and the lower loop phase, which is part of the coalescent tradition. So our hunters and gatherers, we're looking at 500 CE to 1200. There's 12 phases in the Central Plains when it comes to the woodland period. We don't have many sites. The phases are more like focuses rather than a traditional phase in the archaeological sense. But there's two really big differences. In the southern part of the Central Plains, you have cemeteries. In the northwest part of the Central Plains, you have ossuaries. So if we're really looking at identity from an archaeological context, burial patterns are a big indicator. The pots are relatively the same. What defines these foci are really minute differences in some pottery designs, mostly the way the lines go, and what they are hunting, but that's very much based on local food source availability. The main difference here is in Nebraska, you predominantly get ossuaries, where in Kansas, you get cemeteries. Ossuaries are these bundle interments. They're not quite mounds, but large groupings of plural burials. Whereas the cemeteries, these are individual interments of one person. And then we have this Pomona variant, which I mentioned. This is really in eastern Kansas, western Missouri. We're not quite sure where it lies within the hunting and gathering versus horticulturalists, but this is where they're found. They're very much in the eastern part of Kansas. And this is about 950 to 1350. So a little bit late on the scale getting into horticulturalism, but we'll talk about it here in a bit. When we have the horticulturalists, we have the Great Oasis. And I'm realizing that my animations are off. Great Oasis is found in really archaeological research in northwest Iowa and northeast Nebraska. They have corn. And we're finding there's a lot of sites, actually, not a lot, I shouldn't say that. We're finding a few sites in Nebraska, but they've never been dated. No one's actually really intensely looked at Great Oasis. What we do know about it, this is coming from this Northwest Iowa focus, it's about 900 to 1100 is when it exists, but they have corn. And then we have the Central Plains tradition, which in the previous talk I gave you guys, we talked a lot about, and we're going to have some review for this lecture. So 950, this is predominantly Central Plains tradition encompasses the vast majority of Kansas and Nebraska, especially the eastern parts of the state. In the west, in Colorado and Wyoming, you have hunting camps with Central Plains tradition people, but their core area is the eastern half of these states. And it existed from what's in the literature, what we believed for a very long time, from 950 to 1450, and it starts in the southeast quadrant of the Central Plains tradition along the Missouri River, and they also have corn, right? So we're already thinking, okay, well, Carlton was talking about the South Bands. They came along the Missouri River and they had corn, right? Well, hold on to that. Keep thinking about it. And it spreads westward. So it follows the Missouri River, the Kansas River, Republican Loop Platte. So it's in that Missouri River drainage, and it extends out into Nebraska and Kansas westward. So that's traditionally how we thought about Central Plains tradition people, is that this is a immigrant population coming in and displacing or intermarrying with local woodland folks, and they're bringing corn with them from the southeast. That's how they've been thought traditionally. Then we have Central Plains Oneota. They're in the eastern part of Nebraska and northeastern part of Kansas. They're coming in from Minnesota. We know where these are definitely immigrants. We can see them marching across Iowa and Minnesota to get here. They're about 1,200 to 1,400. They are also in north central Kansas and south central Nebraska, but no one has really looked at them either or dated them traditionally. So we didn't really know. So we have a couple of these archaeological components that involve agriculture that we don't really know much about or have ideas of to when they existed. And that's a topic of part of this research was let's date those cultural units. And of course, we have the agriculturalists. These are 100% ancestral Pawnees, Arikiras, and Wichitas, initial coalescent variant. That's here along the Dakotas. It occurs towards the middle of the medieval global warming period, and it spreads northward. The extended coalescent variant, it goes north here along the Missouri River, and then we have the lower loop phase. And that is part of this coalescent tradition. That is, Pawnee archaeology without European goods. So extended coalescent variant, those are Arikaras. Lower loop phase of part of this coalescent tradition, those are Pawnees. So now, how do we tie all this in together? How are we weaving together the oral traditions with the archaeological record? And that's where the radiocarbon data starts to come in. So what can we radiocarbon date? When I talked to you guys last, I talked to you about Bayesian statistics and early chronometric hygiene protocol. And this is coming from two people, Donna Roper and Donald Blakesley. So there's a couple things of what we can date. And what Donna suggests, corn, food residue, bark, timbers, like these are all things that we're all aware of. Then there's also things we can't date. And this is really coming from Blakesley. Then this is a Central Plains model. Samples run by Kikuchian Laboratories. They didn't do so well in the 90s, and we haven't really trusted themselves. We have juniper, which you don't want to date juniper because it's an old wood. And then samples run on mussel shell because of the freshwater reservoir effect, which changes the ratios between carbon and nitrogen. So you want to stay away from those things. And you don't want to use these. So when you're creating chronologies or dating sites, these are samples you don't use at all. But that doesn't mean the samples you do use are equal. And that's what Donna in 2014 was really showing is, hey, if you want high confidence that the sample that you are dating is directly tied to the human behavior that you're trying to understand, this is what you want to use. Corn, seeds, nuts, or bison bone in particular. Not all bone is equal. Herbivore bones, specifically bison in the Great Plains, they have a very high confidence level. And as you go down this list, they get less accurate. And most importantly, you want to avoid unidentifiable lumps of charcoal because you don't know what species of wood that is. And there's a couple other issues that we'll talk about. So I've built upon this chronometric hygiene protocol over the years as I've learned more and more about the process. And I've added a couple ones. One, we can now with OxCal, we've been able to for a bit, we can still utilize these 2C dates, these lumps of charcoal. We create charcoal outlier models and we can still incorporate them to a model. But some things that I've added, one, samples with non-normalized age distributions. This was big before 1996. And a lot of radiocarbon chronologies, especially in the plains, were still utilizing these. So this is one of the first analyses done in the Great Plains that specifically mentioned you can't use these data. And then lastly, and this one people ask about, avoiding samples run on ancestors, right? In the States, we're having these large conversations regarding NAGPRA and permissions. So now you can't even use these data, period. But also there's another reason for it. One, especially in the Central Plains, a lot of people, especially in the western part of Nebraska, were eating a lot of fish and mussel shells. So if you don't care about the ethical aspects of running samples on dead Indians without their consent, they're probably going to be affected, or you have an increased risk of those ancestors in the Central Plains being affected also by the freshwater reservoir effect because of their diet. and that affecting the makeup in their bones. So food for thought. So what I did is applied this chronometric hygiene protocol to 852 radiocarbon dates, to 9 archaeological taxa, and I created 31 Bayesian statistical models to test, hey, does it matter what kind of dates you use to create chronologies? And if so, what do the results show as you test these things? So I dated 9 sites across Nebraska. Donna Roper, in her article where she called for, hey, something's weird with our radiocarbon data, she dated Central Plains tradition sites and other late Holocene woodland or early Plains village period sites in Kansas and southern Nebraska. I completed the data set by targeting more sites in Nebraska, specifically central Nebraska and northeastern Nebraska, which had really low data. So targeting sites that we believe were earliest, we can isolate occupation, and I got new dates for them. And so I have to really show my gratitude to the Society for American Archaeology, the Plains Anthropological Society, among others, for funding radiocarbon data, because it was like over 30 grand I had to raise for my PhD to do this. So the new dates come from these sites. It's a mix of Great Oasis sites. The only Great Oasis site dated in to the 2 that are dated in Nebraska, I dated several Central Plains tradition sites, and an extended coalescent site called Redbird, which within Central Plains Archaeology has been contentious, and I wanted to get new dates on it and see what that could say, as well as some a lower loop site, or what we thought was a lower loop site, the Young site 25CU25, and we'll also talk about that later. So this is the list. The brackets where it says PD, those were previously dated sites. So we had the Packer site, it was previously dated, but something else. I wanted to compare, like, hey, these sites only have wood charcoal dates. Why don't we get some bone AMS dates and see how those compare and which one's more accurate? So that was the purpose of that. And so when we take one site in particular, Rulo, 25RH70, the UCI dates, those are my dates that I collected. So this one had been previously dated. It had some weird dates before, and all the dates, the Texas dates, the OS dates, those were all wood charcoal dates. And all of my UCI dates, I don't know if you can see this bracket, they were really tightly bounded. This one's a little wonky because it's at the end of that radiocarbon plateau. But we can see this wood charcoal from the same context are really downweighting the chronology of the site to be older. And this one is like 1,000 years older, 1,200 years older than what I was pulling. So there's instances where you can just look at the Bayesian analysis and be like, whoa, those wood charcoal dates they have large boundaries and they're always older. And this is where we're starting to see parts of the old wood effect come into play. So making models, just to repeat, 852 radiocarbon dates. This is the Central Plains data set for 1,000 years within Kansas and Nebraska. We're not very fortunate like Wyoming that has thousands of dates. A lot of that involves Wyoming has a lot of federal property, a lot of public land. Kansas and Nebraska don't. The 9 archaeological taxa that we've discussed and the 31 Bayesian models. So making models. I had 4 data sets. I had late woodland, the early Plains village. I took a subset of early Plains village and looked at the Central Plains tradition itself. And then I looked at late Plains village as its own. And I ran 4 different models for each data set based off of the hygiene protocol. So I had model A, and I need to find a better way to name these models, to be honest. So thoughts, let me know, send me an email. Model A was every radiocarbon date that belonged up here, including the non-normalized age distribution. And this is how models have been created in the Central Plains for the past 50 years. This is the data set that best illustrates the current or previously current, the most accepted chronology for the Central Plains. Model B is how they should have been run since 1987. In 1987, folks in the field were already saying, hey, non-normalized age distributions, like those dates, you can't use them. Something got lost in translation in the Great Plains. I don't know. Then we have model C. This is what Roper proposed. In her model, she said, hey, these 2 C dates, they're bad, get rid of them. So this is, I was like, well, let's see what what Donna says, this large data set. What happens if we just get rid of the charcoal dates, that we don't know the species of the wood or where it came from? And then there's Model D. This is a best practice approach, how you should be doing radiocarbon data. You're using an outlier model with an oxcal. You're getting rid of the non-normalized age distributions. This should be what you're looking at. Or no, we're just going to look at the Central Plains tradition because that has the most consequences for what I came up with. So if we look at the Central Plains tradition, this is Model A. This is everything under the sun. It goes with the traditional route, Smoky Hill phase. I will show you guys a map. That's in Kansas. And we see a lot of the Kansas-based Central Plains tradition phases are in Kansas. It's Scotty phase, which is in central Nebraska. This one kept showing up early, and it usually doesn't. Part of that is some of the sites that we dated were at Scotty were the oldest. So that was already fascinating to see, like, oh, we have some really old at Scotty dates. That's new in and of itself. Model B, right? This is where you drop the normalized distributions. This is where things get a little crazy. Relatively, Scotty comes up first again. And so what that's showing is that some of those dates that were making some of those phases earlier were based off of bad radiocarbon dates. Then we move to Model C. We just get rid of charcoal dates. Things go back to Smoky Hill being the oldest. A lot of things get moved further back. And then you have the best case study, what you're supposed to have when you assign non-confidence to these charcoal dates. Everything is still moving a little bit further back. But at the beginning of the talk, I talked about traditionally, hey, Central Plains tradition started in 950 in the Steve Kisker site space. None of my models showed that when you start doing Bayesian, which was interesting. And part of this is some of the data that were used, right? When you actually break down how many dates are being used and why some don't change, the St. Helena phase, I was the first person to date the St. Helena phase with bone dates. There were 5 dates from the 80s that represented that phase and why it was the oldest. Threw that out the window. So that's why it doesn't change much, because these 5 dates get thrown off right at the bat. Some like, I'm going to move this thing, sorry. Some phases, like Solomon River, same deal. I need to go to the Smithsonian and redate that. That's useless. But so you can see just how the data is being affected based on radiocarbon samples and why some of these do or don't change. And this has a huge consequence of trying to understand horticulture and the introduction of maize, right? If we don't have the dates, we can't say the time. And if we don't know the time, we can't talk about human behavior. This is what the math says. Right. These are the dates themselves in table form. The bottom on these lists is always the one that's the earliest to the latest. St. Helena is still one of the latest phases, but traditionally it was thought to have appeared in the late 1300s, and we're showing, hey, no, these sites are actually showing up in the 1200s. So even before getting into analysis, these new data that we were collecting by targeting specific assemblages based on the availability of radiocarbon data, we were already changing the chronology. Now, these two actually, it was cool to see that these were rather similar, even with the charcoal dates being included. That they showed a strong similarity to the outlier model. Now, there are some differences. There are some changes, but this was just really interesting to see that we're going to pursue a little bit more in terms of how that works. The biggest one here, though, is the Smoky Hill phase. That one gets bumped up a couple times. So, and once again, that's just the availability of radiocarbon data, what we have. And so how we can actually see what's the visibility of these changes. So these are those, the results of these analysis at the 95%, 1 sigma value from the mean. I just butchered all that math. It is 1 standard deviation away. So this is what you get. But under Model D, we have at Scotty, the earliest Central Plains tradition phase is actually starting 200 years later than what archaeologists talk about. That's important. So when we have this new timeline, and these are all the dates now. A couple fun things out of this, and I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, and I'm going to wrap this up because I know you guys have been on. We're almost approaching an hour. We dated this site, the Young site, which was supposed to be lower loop. And I just thought it'd be fun to date a Pawnee hunting camp in Nebraska. I was like, well, we don't have many dates on it. There were a couple. They turned out to be those non-normalized dates, and we got good dates on them. The site became like 200 years younger. We started looking at it like, wait a minute, this isn't a lower loop site. This is an initial coalescent variant site. It's the most, it was, that's a whole different thing that I got to get into at some point in my career. We changed a site taxonomy by like getting these new dates, being like, wait a minute, this shouldn't be there. And then looking at the pottery and being like, oh, this isn't actually lower loop. It was misclassified. This is actually an initial coalescent variant hunting camp, the only one we know about. Holy crap, that's awesome. We changed Central Plains tradition. So when in that early Plains data set, which we haven't looked at, when we take all these dates down here together, this is what you get. And we're showing a very much Central Plains tradition is kicking off in the 1100s. The Kansas data set on the woodland, I don't know how to explain these. These dates were horrible. We have to redate the woodland of components, and that's a cool thing I got to do here at the University of Kansas is I have all those sites in my collection. So to be determined. And initial coalescent variant stays relatively the same from what we knew about. So the big takeaways was the Central Plains tradition, all that other good stuff. And when you compare it to, you take this research, the Bayesian productions, another analysis I did with Dr. Doug Bamforth and Dr. Casey Carlson, which was looked at the Lynch site. My thesis is horrible. Now that I actually know what I'm doing, those dates are incredibly wrong. But also, if you look at the literature, when are these phases supposed to be appearing? This is how archaeologists in the Central Plains think about the time span. This is the Bayesian. This is the math. This is what archaeologists think are happening on the plains. And so you get a new timeline. And we'll get to pulling it back with the indigenous oral traditions. We get a brand new timeline in which the Central Plains tradition no longer spans a 400, 500 year time period. It's now about 300 years. That maize, the transition from hunting and gathering in the Central Plains, ancestral Pawnees, to full-blown agriculture is a 300-year period. And not only that, the earliest site that we had with corn didn't come from southeast or northeast Kansas with the Steed-Kisker phase, which is what traditionally archaeologists have thought. It actually showed up in an Itzcotti phase site in central Nebraska, 15 miles away from where the Skeety Pawnee oral tradition says that's where they first got corn. Now, granted, on the plains itself, it came from Great Oasis to the northeast, but part of that Skeety oral tradition talks about getting corn from the people to the north. It's part of our clothesman tradition. And so Central Plains tradition, it didn't start, it's not this immigrative population coming out of Cahokia in 950 or tangentially with Cahokia in 950, moving up the Missouri River. It is starting locally in the Central Plains in the heart of Pawnee country, and it is moving outward. It flips the script, and it doesn't really radically change our understanding of what happens. The time changes, but all we've had to do is flip-flop the chronology of the pottery. So there's this whole context. It still fits, but it happens 200 years later, and it happens several hundred miles away in central Nebraska. Because part of the old controversy with the Central Plains tradition, it's like they're supposed to be this immigrant population, but we can't find them down the Missouri River. No, it's a local woodland population getting corn from somewhere northeast, growing it, and boom, it creates a transition. Where do the South bands fit in this? I really didn't focus on them because I'm skeety, but they're somehow part of this. Now, there's still that southeastern Central Plains tradition relationship with the Mississippians. We do see Mississippian stuff, but not lifeways in the southeast. And Smoky Hill was still one of those early, even with the new radiocarbon protocol, one of these new things. So that came after it, Scotty. So like now I really got to sit down. Next steps is like sitting down, like, okay, now really trying to suss it out. Now looking at individual site chronologies and starting to connect the dots as to which ones are first. But what I thought was like just the most, because the big takeaway is like really changing how we think about how maize appeared in the Central Plains and what that means for the Pawnee. And I thought that was, as a Skeety myself, saying, wow, the earliest site with corn in Nebraska, outside of Great Oasis in Northwest Iowa, it's down the road from where my people say we got corn. That gave me chills when me and Doug were like looking at these results and like, whoa. And then seeing how the ripple effect, right? It completely upended things. Um, and so with that, thank you guys for hosting me. This is my email. I'd love to answer questions. I love feedback on this talk. Like I said, this is the first time I've actually given it to anybody outside my committee. And even my committee was like a 15-minute presentation. Um, condensing a 500-page document into an hour-long talk is a task. So I would love feedback if you're willing to give it to me. So with that, thank you guys so much for having me, and I'd love to answer any questions you may have.